With the future in front of us, the past seems so distant. The steps our ancestors took feel so foreign, but the reality is that we are surrounded by giants that keep us in check. When we look up at the sky, it's the same sun and the same moon that humans wondered about for over 10,000 years. And when you take your next step, you realize this was the same earth that all of humanity walked before you. The air we breathe and the water we drink are all clues to where we have been and where we might go. And right now, I want to appreciate the world that Oda has built. We have been jumping from past to present to the future with nearly every arc ever since we got into the Grand Line. Each arc containing a burden of the past that weighs down the present with a future that seems dystopian or hopeless. But on top of that, we are jumping in and out of historical context like feudal Japan with Wano, but then straight into 500 years into the future with Egghead. And now Elbaff is looming over our shoulders, an arc that might be the greatest context we'll ever get for the One Piece world. We have been waiting for this arc since the beginning of this channel, and since Little Garn for most of us. And finally, now we have found out that Nika was a legendary figure from Elbaff that existed so far in the past that it's hard for us to contextualize it, since we don't have the history to understand what that world looked like. But the reality is that the Elbaff we are about to land on is the same Elbaff that existed during Nika's time. So the moment we see the land in full is when we'll be able to recognize some truths about Nika. And so I thought it would be really interesting to theorize what the modern island of Elbaff will look like, or rather, I guess more specifically, why Elbaff is the land of giants. Yes, I think Oda has given us enough context about how the One Piece world works to understand one of the biggest mysteries of the past. So if you're new to the channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Par vision. Which brings us to this video's sponsor, World of Warships. Using the link in the description, you can download this massive free-to-play naval warfare themed game that's available on PC and console, where you can command a massive naval fleet featuring some of history's most iconic war vessels, and unlock new ships as you prepare to dominate the seas in World of Warships. You don't want to miss the 6th wave of Azure Lane coming to World of Warships, bringing brand new Azure Lane themed premium ships, commanders, and skins that will enhance naval battles. New commanders like Shimakaze and Hornet, each with full voice packs that really bring the game to life, alongside the enhanced graphics with highly detailed weather effects that really make you feel like you're there. Whether in a division with friends or captaining a solo adventure, you can get a variety of gameplay with team play, solo modes, or with diverse ship classes, like the unique aircraft carrier and destroyer ship classes with Azure Lane themes. Make sure to download World of Warship using the first link in the description, and during registration, use the promo invite code 6th Wave Azure Lane to get 1.5 million credits, 600 doubloons, 7 days access to a premium account, 1 Azure Lane crate, Shimakaze Azure Lane Commander, Fuso Azure Lane Commander, and the Japanese destroyer ship Fubuki, all for free. Thank you World of Warships for sponsoring this video. The larger-than-life giants couldn't feel more foreign to us since the start of the series. When we were introduced to them, it was under the pretext that spending 100 years to settle a dispute is something us puny, tiny humans could never fathom, because that's longer than our entire lifespan. Even recently, when the Gorosei showed us their full demonic forms that are terrifying from just their size alone, it was then blunted with the arrival of the giants, who casually said that while they were colossal, they were like the forest animals from Elbaff. And the reality is that this giant environment that has been kind of idolized and feared from the world around is not as unique as we might think. It's not like Elbaff is on another planet. It sits on the same strip of ocean, grown on the same soil, sourced from the same planet, and uses the same air to breathe. And while that may be true, I'm going to start off with a contradiction and say that the reality that Elbaff sits on may feel more otherworldly than not. And how I got to that answer was kind of simple. See, in our world, when we witness a human exceeding our humanly expectations, we often ask the parents, what are you feeding them? For example, when Usain Bolt won the Olympic gold for the 100 meter at the Beijing Olympics, his father said it was thanks to yams. So in a sense, we'll be uncovering what Elbaff's yams are. And again, it was a lot simpler than you might think. The main feature of Elbaff is the giant tree that sits at the center. Now, for the sake of being thorough, we don't know what this tree actually is, but it's heavily implied by the series that this tree is the jewel tree Adam. Again, it was never confirmed that Elbaff had a tree named Adam, nor that the Adam tree is on Elbaff, but it was said that the tree is the survivor of a land that is consumed in an endless war, which we can then connect to the recent reveal that Elbaff is located in a region called Warland. So it's not unreasonable that the mythical tree that Frankie built the Thousand Sunny out of and Tom built the Oro Jackson out of would eventually be the giant tree we saw in Big Mom's flashback. And I say all that because it might turn out that on Elbaff, this tree might have another name extreme than what the world knows it to be, but that's for a conversation in another video. Back on focus, regardless of the name or its attributes, this large tree has to be regarded as one of the main attributes of the island that we can then deduce various details from. Besides the giants, we also know that the animals are extremely large here as well. And while this may seem odd, we've seen this so many times before in the world of One Piece. We actually get an insane juxtaposition of how the same piece of land survives in different biomes, specifically talking about Jaya here, because of the first knock-up stream. Jaya got split apart and a large chunk of it was put on top of the Emperor Cloud above Skypiea. This is super relevant because Jaya on the Blue Sea exhibited completely normal forest attributes. Nothing stuck out to the Straw Hats except obviously the enlarged bugs. But I have a theory on the bug stuff. If you haven't seen part 1 of my Beetles theory, go check that out, because I promise part 2 is coming soon. Just need to get some of these base theories out first. Anyways, Jaya on the Blue Sea had a normal forest, whereas the same piece of land in the sky showed several attributes more similar to Elbaf actually. The trees were so overgrown and massive that it was noted a few times. And keep in mind, this difference was a span of 400 years, whereas if the assumption is that Elbaf existed from the time of Nika that predated the Void Century and it houses a tree that is the only remaining survivor through all the wars that occurred then the giant central tree here would be well over 900 years old, and probably much older. And so going back to Jaya, there's so many things to consider because using our normal logic, plant life does not really bode well at high altitudes, whether it be due to the temperature or ability to withstand the sun. But in One Piece from chapter 253, we can see the assertion made by our knowledgeable Robin that there's something about the environment of Skypiea that has the power to rapidly speed up the growth of fauna and flora. And to make this theory a lot shorter than my research needed to be, I think it can be healthily acknowledged that though Oda brings real science into his story, it's actually a caricature of reality, or within a bubble of what he typically desires. And I think he does this with mythos and literary allusions as well. What's fun is that though he will take science to a fictional degree, it's usually rooted in some kind of natural phenomenon that we have. And so in the case of Skypiea and with Vars, what we hear from Gonfall is this profound understanding that things can grow on island clouds, but they cannot be born there. Greenery and soil don't normally exist in the sky. And what that means is that the birth of life requires soil, which will be important for another video, but for this one we can eliminate soil from the equation because both Jaya on the Blue Sea and Jaya in the sky have soil, and the difference is just the sea that they sit on. Gonfall says that island clouds can support growth, and from what Robin says, the difference in seas would be reasonable to attribute to the rapid growth of the trees. So that's when we have to go back to chapter 240 to start dissecting the differences between sea clouds and the Blue Sea. What we start off with is the difference between normal clouds and island and sea clouds, which is the condensation nuclei. To be a little descriptive of what a condensation nuclei is, it would simply be a particle that serves as a nucleus for water vapor to surround. So for normal clouds, it could be many things like dust, carbon, soot, clay, and anything that can be aerosolized into the atmosphere, which is part of the reason why there are different kinds of clouds with different kinds of properties. And if you remember, dance powder from Alabasta was essentially manipulating the nuclei to encourage rain to form. This is based on the very real weather modification method called cloud seeding, to which there are several materials being used, like potassium iodine, dry ice, which is carbon, even table salt. But where this connects to dance powder is that Oda told us the recipe for it, which was silver. And as you know, I made a huge video about this connection because the real world version is silver iodine, which looks very similar to gold, and I connected all of this back in my Pluton video. But the main thing that was needed was something to jettison or distribute the particles high enough into the sky to affect the clouds, which is why volcanoes play a big role here, because they can create what's known as pyroclastic clouds with various materials that would be suitable to create their own variants of normally darker clouds, which connects directly back to chapter 240 because Pagaya tells us the condensation nuclei that Skypiea and Vegapunk uses to create these clouds that allow people to stand on or sail on is pyrobloin. To again be thorough, the way I read this is that the mineral sea prism stone found on the Blue Sea, amongst other components to its stone, contains pyrobloin as one of them. them, and the pyrobloin is essentially particles of keratin which are sourced from volcanic eruptions, which that pyrobloin is good at absorbing moisture, and the density of it can be manipulated to create sea clouds and island clouds, roads, chairs, and anything else really. Now, I don't think pyrobloin is the specific ingredient in sea stone that causes weakness to devil fruit users. It's most likely involved in that process because of its ability to retain water. I say that because the sea clouds operate the same way as the blue sea does with devil fruit users, in that the weakness comes from submersion in water, not the ocean itself. As Oda clarifies in the SBS that I find people still to this day don't fully understand that devil fruit users would get weak if they fully submerge themselves even in a bathtub of fresh water. Sea prism stones simply emit the energy of the ocean, which is why on contact a devil fruit user gets weakened, so technically it gives the energy of being submerged in water, but since pyrobloin is just an ingredient, devil fruit users aren't weakened by touching an island cloud, for example. Now, I think pyrobloin is important, but not entirely for this context. Though, if I were to give some idea where my head's at for this, it would be that if it were mistranslated where the L and R were exchanged, it would be broin, which could be Oda just pronouncing brine in a weird way, and if this were the case, it would be pyro, which means fire, and brine, which means extremely salty water. You'll see why this understanding of pyrobloin isn't important here in a little bit, but the other side of this is that even if it were to mean fire salt water, it was kind of overwritten by the canon description of it being particles of keratin, which for those that don't know, keratin is fibrous protein that makes up things like horns, scales, turtle shells, reptile scales, hair, and nails. Now again, I could deep dive this part too to give you my understanding, but I only addressed this so that I wouldn't get the comments saying that I forgot about this, but trust me, I think keratin comes into play for a different aspect of the One Piece world that we'll discuss in another video, because the reality is that the pyrobloin is what makes these fictional clouds differ from normal clouds, not the blue sea, especially because if it's a component of sea stone, it wouldn't be something different than the blue sea. The answer is much simpler. It's just that the sea clouds are fresh water. The same difference that would make sense to explain our clouds too. The water cycle has it that when water vapor rises, it leaves minerals behind to form clouds, with particles in the sky that are small and light enough to float, and sea salt would be too heavy, which is why rain is fresh water. It may not be clean water, but it is technically fresh, which we can use One Piece as a reference for this because in multiple locations this is confirmed. But recently with Wano, we see that the entire basin that creates the sea around the elevated Wano Island is all fresh water that was said to have been entirely made up of accumulated rainwater. So to circle back, the reason why things can grow on clouds is because they have fresh water, but because the knocked up Jaya has soil too, it's most likely because of this nearly unlimited, purified, and fictionally dense source of fresh water that it's able to support plant life to this extent that we see, which is true of our world and reflected in the One Piece world. It's a known thing that trees in general do not do well with salt water, which is why you rarely see forest trees and oceans touching. They'd usually be separated by a beach or an embankment, because salt concentrated water can kill or incredibly inhibit plant growth. There are mangrove trees that are the only trees that are suitable for straight seawater like we see of Sabaody, but if we go to Alabasta, the lack of rainwater resulted in a receding freshwater river presence, which meant more and more of the land was integrated with the ocean, and is why the city of Erumalu, which was green and full of life at one point, is no longer the case, because even with the more tropical plant life that we see, it cannot survive with salt water. In fact, salting land was a common practice generals used during war to completely destroy another kingdom's ability to create crops when the conquerors could not reasonably occupy the land during the invasion. And so I think the reason why Jaya in the sky flourished while Jaya on the blue sea remained standard is simply because one is an island surrounded by a saltwater ocean and the other is surrounded by a freshwater ocean. The soil called Vars is essentially sitting on a permanently accessible source of fresh water. There's no need for rain because it's sitting on the rain. In a way, the roots of the trees are planted in heaven because the water is in a vaporized form, which would make it easier to process. And if you are still skeptical about my deduction here of the fact that the fresh water is most likely the One Piece reason for the trees on Jaya to defy real world logic of high altitude plants flourishing, let me say I did consider a bunch of other possibilities, which will reflect eventually in full as more videos come out, like the one about pyrobloin. But to give you some context, other possibilities I considered for the reason why the answer here is fresh water rather than carbon or potassium, for example, which as the building block of life, if plant life was exposed to more carbon, you would find them to be larger. And I did say earlier that carbon dioxide in the form of dry ice could be used to make clouds, but that was for cloud seeding. So if carbon dioxide were in the equation, the cloud either wouldn't look like this, or it would cause the cloud to create rain. But we know the emperor cloud is more like a sponge of moisture because it never creates rain. And even if you weren't convinced that there wasn't salt in the White Sea sky clouds, then what's super interesting is that what we know is that it's the density of the pyrobloin that creates the consistency of the cloud. So the sea clouds are dense enough to sail a boat or float an island, but salt is what gives ocean water much of its buoyancy. Robin says in chapter 237 that these clouds are far less buoyant than water, and in order to cope with that, the fish here became giant balloons or flat. And this was even tested by Usopp, who normally can swim, but would have just fallen through. And if there was salt, it would have provided more buoyancy to prevent this. But this is also how you know this doesn't exist in the clouds, because it would be too heavy to even float in the sky. And yes, if you're wondering if you've swam before, you've probably noticed that without taking ocean currents into consideration, salty ocean water is much easier to float in than purified fresh water, and is something swimmers actually have to consider when considering their body movements when going to fresh water from saltwater swimming. All because salt makes the water denser and thus better able to support the weight above it, which would be the buoyancy factor. But the interesting thing is that Sky Jaya not only has overgrown plant life, it also has overgrown south birds, which is another control we can use to make an assessment here. For some reason, south birds in the sky were much bigger than blue sea south birds, but also notably nicer. Personally, I think it was because the skies were much more hospitable in the long run than on the blue sea, but I think this is also due to the fresh water. Now, we know that the sea creatures were larger to cope with the buoyancy problem, but the birds don't need to stay buoyant. And I did consider maybe it was a byproduct of eating such large plants, but that doesn't make sense either, because larger plants just means more food, not that the food supersizes you as well. And to fully apply this logic, we have to use some more One Piece comparisons, which is hard to do given how large some One Piece animals are. But that's where it gets really interesting, because if you were to look at the places that are specifically freshwater reservoirs, you get giant land animals in association. The best example would be Wano, where we see not only are the freshwater dependent koi fish that grow to size according to their environment become giant behemoths that can climb a waterfall and pull a ship, but also the land animals are all massive. Every single animal here was large enough to be an East Blue raid boss, not to mention the mountain god Yama that was literally the size of a city. And remember, yes, the water on Wano wasn't clean. Technically, it was still freshwater. It was just poison. So I guess in One Piece logic, that results in malnourishment or death, but the animals became resilient to it. And Wano was a recent example of this giant standard size of animal next to an also nearly unlimited source of fresh water, which is another quick example from Wano that exemplifies the difference in freshwater and saltwater with a bit of One Piece logic applied, is that because Wano is filled with fresh water, that's why the old Wano ruins are nearly perfectly preserved, which again applies the gap in difference of what the One Piece world depicts as the effect of saltwater versus freshwater. But going back to the animal size thing, I know it's a little shaky because of how erratic the One Piece world is, but when looking at land animals specifically, the only place where gigantic animals are a standard is when they are surrounded by fresh water. Yes, there are big animals in other places, but usually they aren't standard. It's more that the Straw Hats came across an abnormally large animal or the boss of an island. As an example, we have seen a larger tiger in Goa Kingdom, but we've also seen normal sized animals there as well, reflecting that the standard size of the wild animals on Wano and Upper Yard Skypiea is larger than the standard size of its blue sea counterpart, directly seen with the South Bird as an example. And there is one glaring exception to this rule, but this realization might actually have solved a huge mystery in the One Piece world, so this will be the one hard detour I take in the Elbaff video. And if you like this video so far, please like and subscribe, because I promise I will get back to the main topic in a second. But the exception was Rusukaina. The island that Luffy trained on during the 2-year time skip exhibited a standard of animal size that was probably most similar to what we would have expected of Elbaff. Now, this island was an anomaly amongst anomalies because not only did it have large animals, but it was also the only island that has 48 different seasons, or a different season each week. And I caution myself to say it's on the Grand Line because that's where it gets interesting. It's actually not in the Grand Line, it's on the Calm Belt. And that might be the clue here. It might be that the water in the calm belt is fresh water, or at least let's say a lot lower in salinity than the ocean around it, which could explain how the seas stay separate. The salinity of the calm belt being much lower would create a meeting point which would eventually mix, but at a much slower rate. But also the lack of currents could be supported by the lower salinity in the water, as Nami was saying also contributes to sea currents in chapter 604. And on top of this, most of us know that the phenomenon called the calm belt in One Piece is actually just a reflection of what we know as doldrums or the calms, or officially known as the intertropical convergence zone. Roughly near the equator, there is a zone above and below the equator that experiences monotonous windless weather, which if you didn't know, air movement and wind contribute a lot to wave formation and thus water movement. So the only difference between the calm belt in our world and the One Piece world is basically the presence of sea kings. And along with that, the doldrums of our world also has a notably lower salinity on the surface that separates it from the oceans above and below the lines, which is what I would be asserting to be true of the calm belt, which is why Rusukaina might not actually be an exception, and the large standard of animal size and forest size is actually because it is blessed by a large amount of fresh water. Also, one more similarity that will be relevant much later on is Rusukaina has volcanoes, Wano is on top of a volcano, and Skypia's clouds have particles from volcanoes, so don't worry, I'm not discounting that. But volcanoes won't be at the forefront of this video, but very relevant, and we will build upon that eventually. But to finally circle back to the main topic, large amounts of fresh water in the One Piece world will most likely contribute to giant flora and fauna. Sky Island, Wano, and most likely Rusukaina will help substantiate that. And after sifting all of these clues, I think it would be appropriate to assume that Warland, the region of ocean where Elbaff sits in, must then be extremely purified and have some form of body of water that is salt-free fresh water, on the tier that would make this nearly impossible to equate to any other place on the One Piece planet. And this would have to be even more true for the express fact of how large this giant tree on Elbaff is. Even on a normal island supporting this much plant life, it would be incredibly difficult. I mean, that's why the natural motif is the giant tree is dead center on an island. But with Elbaff, it's almost comically disproportionate that it would be laughable to think that this tree could grow so large despite it being surrounded by seawater, which, as we have confirmed, is a general standard in the One Piece world that crops cannot grow with seawater, which maybe it could be that this tree is an outlier, but my assertion that Elbaff has a huge reservoir of fresh water would also explain all of Elbaff's life forms being massive, not just the Atom Tree or whatever this giant central tree is. The reason why this tree could stand above others is because it was the last survivor over the course of all the wars that it has experienced, and because the freshwater would explain the giant fauna and flora around this tree being so gigantic, that's why I'm leaning towards this idea that this tree functions like the trees we have seen in the past. And so finally, now that I planted the roots for the foundation of this theory, I want to paint a picture of what I think is happening here on Elbaff. Time to lock it in. As we know, Elbaff is an obvious reference to Norse mythology and various Nordic references, whether it be from architecture to the Viking aesthetics, but also the prince's name being a direct reference to Loki, the well-known trickster god with various origin stories and legends that affected all the realms. An emphasis on all the realms because a long looming question is whether Oda would use this concept with Elbaff, and if yes, how would Oda portray Elbaff along one of the most romanticized mythologies alongside the Greeks and Roman mythologies. And so I think based on what we discussed in this video so far, it all actually fits nearly perfectly with what we should expect with Elbaff. So the primal focus again here is the central tree, which most of us would know would be considered a mythical world tree, and in the Norse context that would be Yggdrasil. If Oda were to use some of the elements of Yggdrasil here, then along with that would be the realms that this tree reaches. Now I want to clarify, there's a portion of this lore that I will save for another time, and right now I want to focus in on the structure. So one massive consideration we have to realize with a giant tree like of the one we see on Elbaff is that we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg, or rather we are only seeing a portion of the tip of the iceberg because we don't even see the canopy. But most importantly, with any tree, the roots are hidden beneath the surface. And that's when you have to consider that with a tree this large, the Elbaff that we see and the tiny land and even the tree itself is basically only half of the tree, if that at all. The reality is that beneath the surface, in order to stabilize this massive tree, it would need an extensive root network to stabilize the tree. With a tree this massive, it would need a massive foundation, which would mean that Elbaff itself is just the peak of the mountain most likely. And though we don't know how this tree is planted because it would change a lot depending on how the tree was supported, but there's a few options for how this could look. It's likely that this tree has a taproot that goes straight down, providing major nutrient supply and primary stability. The rest of the roots and possibilities could greatly change the landscape of Elbaff under the ocean. It's possible that Oda goes with a mixture of combinations, especially with the updates from chapter 11-15, where we know the sea levels rose 200 meters about 800 years ago. Taking that into consideration, it might not be that Elbaff's overall structure was affected in the macro scale. The reason I say that is because a huge thing to take into consideration, and something we'll fully address in a bit, is that trees need a lot of water. A big oak tree can take in 150 gallons of water a day, so if we were to scale that coefficient up to the size of this behemoth of a tree, I wouldn't even be able to estimate it, but if I were to take a guess, it would mean that this tree is taking in millions, if not billions of gallons of water every single day. And remember, this water most likely has to be fresh water, which would imply that though the tree could be affected by rising sea levels, there was some kind of pre-existing infrastructure that supported this massive demand for fresh water. And that's where we come to probably the most reasonable conclusion for Elbaff. I say that because I could have come to this conclusion from multiple angles, which is that Elbaff will be a big reference to two real islands from our world. What's considered the largest island in our world, and the island which serves as a major freshwater resource due to its unique environmental conditions. And those two islands would be Greenland and Iceland. Now, I think the size will be more reminiscent of Greenland, but I think the main features will be that of Iceland, which a lot of Norse mythologies about the many realms and overall romanticization would be fitting if it was discussing Iceland, which will become more apparent as we go on, but it is also a rough assumption as a lot of the places in Iceland have direct mythos references. So in the next leg of this video, we will be discussing how Elbaff will take reference from Norse mythology mixed in with some real world connections of Iceland and combined with the One Piece world and its logic. So again, Iceland has a huge amount of fresh water, and that's due to its high precipitation amount, but low evaporative rate, which ultimately has accumulated to maintain a large landmass of ice or glaciers. But at the same time, the island has high volcanic activity due to it being so close to geothermal activity beneath the crust. And this ultimately leads to one of the craziest assortments of oxymoronic biomes that almost sound just like a One Piece setting. And so Iceland naturally has this almost fictional level of contrasting hot and cold that is almost reminiscent of Punk Hazard, where Oda actually showed us how two competing hot and cold halves of an island can interact to create wild phenomenon. What he indicated was that the heat from the magma side would create precipitation by spewing hot rocks to the other side, and then at the same time the rush of cold air from the mixture of hot and cold zones would make it constantly precipitate over the island. That basically explains Iceland's situation, except it's warm gulf winds and waters that create the precipitation, not volcanic spillage, and essentially a mixture of those is what I think is occurring on Elbaff. Interestingly enough, Oda made a direct reference to Norse mythology in Punk Hazard, introducing us first to the Sea of Fire, which could be a reference to the Surt's Sea of Fire that is literally a sea that was somehow on fire and was part of the Niflheim realm, which was known to be a primordial place of ice and cold, which was one of the first realms, and then it battled the second realm of heat, which was Muspelheim, which created steam when it met with the ice that created several frozen rivers of elivagar, which were all born or sourced from a specific well of Hvergelmir, which if you don't know Norse mythology, I definitely understand hearing all these new names and not fully registering what's going on. And so to compress the relevant info, I think it helps to give a full picture context of Norse mythology. Remember, in this video, we're going to focus on just the environment of Elbaff. And right now, to give context, there are essentially 3 levels to consider and essential point. Yggdrasil, the world tree that connects the 3 levels, which in the One Piece world would be this massive structure that we presume to be the Atom Tree. There's the underworld where hell is, Midgard where humans generally live, or rather mortals, and then Asgard, the more famous mythical place of gods. To cut to the chase and spoil a future video, I'm currently thinking Asgard is missing from Elbaff right now, or its version of Asgard is not going to be on Elbaff. So luckily, we only really need to focus on the underworld and Midgard, which we can also sort of push out of the way for now, but I think the level that we have interacted with in the story of One Piece is Midgard, which I assume most theories have this to be the case. And just for the record, I think we have also seen Asgard already, and to be really specific, because of chapter 11-15, it might be that a lot of Midgard is underwater, and the part that is showing is actually Jotunheim, which is the mythological Norse land of giants. But we'll discuss that in more detail later on, because right now I want to establish this underworld section, because this part plays a huge role in connecting the entire One Piece world. So like I said before, the underworld in Norse mythology is comprised of icy heat. Not too dissimilar for Punk Hazard, but if you remember in Punk Hazard, there was a lake at the center, and because of how the cold and hot sides are positioned, this worked to bring seawater into the center of the island. This is essentially the opposite of what we want for Elbaff, because remember, we need fresh water. And while there are several ways I can imagine this working, and several ways One Piece logic allows for this to work, I think the safest logic to apply here is Icelandic logic. And I think what is most likely underneath Elbaff is a glacial volcano. Yes, I know it sounds like I made that up. It sounds like that's straight up from the One Piece world too, but nope, this is actually straight from Iceland. One of the largest features of the island is the Vatnajökull, which translates to glacier of lakes. This section of Earth is essentially an ice-capped piece of land or glacier that sits on top of a highly volcanic region, which creates several subglacial volcanic zones or glacial volcanoes. Now what's cool about this setup is that just like Punk Hazard, where this was a lake in the center, you get this effect where this volcanic zone starts to meet with the glacial layer, and this meeting creates several versions of lakes, hence why this place is called Glacier of Lakes. And the best part is, all of these lakes are fresh water, because these glaciers are formed by precipitation or rainwater. So if you were to imagine Elbaff for a second and compare it to Skypiea, then what you get is a volcanic eruption created the consistency to make freshwater sea clouds, and the upper yard is soil that sits on top of that fresh water and reaps the benefit of extremely pure and unlimited fresh water, thus enabling the gigantification of every organic material there. For Elbaff, just substitute the cloud for a glacier and put it at the blue sea level. For this to really work, Elbaff has to be primarily a winter type of island, which we have seen it have harsh winters. And the most fictional part of this setup would be the tree itself. But ironically, Iceland used to be heavily forested in the past with the exact kind of trees that Yggdrasil was theorized to be, or that existed for these sacred trees in Norse mythology. Now, an unnecessary part of the theory that I want to include is that I think underneath Elbaff might be a clear ice block of cylindrical shape that kind of houses the glacial element of Elbaff. Beneath that would be the volcano, and at the center of this would be the giant roots of the giant tree at the center of the island. Now, I said unnecessary because, like I said before, the more important aspect is the icy hot mixture. Oda can create any level of combination for this, but I wanted to take a stab at something specific. The cylindrical ice would act as a wall for the seawater and essentially protect Niflheim, allowing it to exist as a freshwater oasis within the ocean. The reason I think it works like this is because of Norse mythology, and I think it would be a glacial volcano because of Velgamir, or the well of bubbling, boiling spring water, which was said to exist here in Niflheim. This well is important for a bunch of reasons. One is because Niflheim translates to the world of fog or mist, and it's also icy, and this well or bubbly cauldron would create that mist. And I think that's what's essentially being super cooled when it meets the wall in order to create a barrier. But also, this well is where the mythical rivers are born. Now, we don't know how deep this well could go, but the deeper we go, the colder it would get, and somehow in this climate, the Atom Tree or Central Elbaff Tree roots come down and are anchored in this area, and a primary root is positioned into this bubbling spring, which in Norse mythology, the world tree Yggdrasil had 3 primary roots that tapped into 3 wells. One well we talked about, which was in Niflheim, and then there was 1 or 2 wells within Midgard, depending on where the tree was planted. And that being said, going back to Niflheim for a second, my thoughts are that the roots of the tree are not all protected, and some of them breach the cylindrical structure and go into the seawater. And you might be wondering why that part is necessary, but a huge part of Norse mythology in general is the various serpents that interact with the world tree, and with this structure in place, this could facilitate something that connects Elbaff to the entire world. So first, remember how I said a tree of this size would be pulling in so much water through its roots? It would be like millions of gallons per day, if not more, which would mean that this fictional tree would create so much water pressure that it would force water towards it, which by drawing the water towards it, it must flow around. And if it's conjoined with the fact that Elbaff would essentially be a giant desalinization plant, then then as the water gets stripped of the salt in it, the salinity would increase outside of Elbaff, and the reason why that is important is that because if you were to surmise that the roots create a giant current, and the salinity further jettisons the water in a current form, like Nami says in chapter 604, then we have found Yormungandr. Yormungandr was said to be a giant serpent that was thrown into the sea, and it grew so large that it wrapped around all of the lands on the planet, and it could bite its own tail. Now, many have said this would be the red line, but I think differently. See, Oda actually gave us the exact description of Yormungandr in chapter 604. We were told of a giant dragon-like current that was depicted to eat its own tail, and it flowed around the world uninterrupted. And when we take a look at the etymology of Yormungandr, we see Yormun denoting huge or vast, and Gander meaning more vague but referring to snake or river, which if we were to look at the current that Frankie tells us about, it would essentially be an underwater river that flows until it meets itself. But according to legends, you could be sucked into it and follow it for 2,000 years. It makes you wonder what kind of people could even document that in the first place, maybe long-living giants. But what we know is that due to the temperature difference and the salinity change, this current is facilitated, which by the way, this also exists in our world. We call it the global conveyor belt that is invisible to us normally but circles the globe in a similar manner as the theorized Yormungandr, and in our world it takes about 1,000 years for water in a certain part of the track to make it around the world. But this current is moving so much water that its pressure is theorized to be 100 times more than the output of the Amazon rainforest river. And just like in our world, this deep ocean current that acts like a conveyor belt makes it around Iceland or Elbaff due to its massive water output, where it receives the warm Gulf Stream water and it then gets pushed and propelled by the massive glacial chunks that provide a water differential, which is what I'm proposing occurs in the One Piece world with Elbaff. But that's not the only thing of Norse mythology that we can tie here. We can try to contextualize how this tree functions. There's another serpent called the Nidhogg, which is said to be a dragon that gnaws on the world tree from the bottom, trying to poison and harm it. There could be an actual labyrinth of snakes, which I do think does exist, but what was interesting was the venomous part. See, remember these snakes were said to be from the bubbling, boiling spring, which theoretically would be from volcanic activity boiling water. Out of this well came a bunch of rivers, and it was said to be the venom that came from that water that would poison the tree. Now, the reality is that if we are talking about poison to a tree and it's in ocean water, then the venom was most likely just referring to the toxins in the water, or simply salt, as we mentioned before. Salt water would kill plants. And so with a tree this big, it could be said that if the roots were exposed to seawater, then these ocean currents that have been depicted to be snake-like would be trying to gnaw away at it and kill it. And even when we look directly at the poems, it says that the trees were aled with rime. Rime ice is essentially super cooled water droplets from fog, which remember, this region is the land of mist. So it might be that the Nidhogg is not a typical serpent, but rather a very aggressive form of wind or water that somehow blows through this environment, freezing the mist, which would then super cool the roots and function as the mythical venom that kills the world tree. And again, that's where we get the reality that we have something in the One Piece world that works exactly like this, which is the White Strom. If you remember from chapter 654, this was a current like snake that appeared in the deep ocean. It was violent and sporadic, but we got an inner look, and weirdly enough, though it was in the water, it was a giant tube of air. We have no idea where it goes and what it does, because it was way too dangerous for the Straw Hats to even entertain. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was also connected to Elbaff, especially because Oda called it the White Strom, which uses Nordic spelling conventions here. And something I wanted to throw in here about the roots being exposed to ocean water and poisoned, it might be that because the Atom Tree is said to be unchoppable, these roots prevent a unique situation for harvesting this wood. Somehow Atom Wood is sourced from this massive unchoppable tree that has survived through endless wars. So maybe the Atom Wood isn't from the tree trunk or the unchoppable parts, maybe its wood is weakened by seawater and pruned by protectors of the tree. It might be that the roots need to be periodically pruned to maintain the health and stability of the tree. But I'll elaborate that at another time. But just before we move on, remember the spiky nature of this rhyme for a second, because it's at this point I think we could say we successfully contextualize what is beneath Elbaff. This structure will probably be the most crucial aspect of Elbaff, because like I said before, Elbaff has to have a huge freshwater reservoir. Since we are getting Elbaff, which is based on what seems to be Norse mythology and Icelandic geography, it's not a question of whether Oda will use the 9 realms of mythology, but it's more so how. how? And I think this is how, because ironically, half of the complications of the world building of Norse mythology is rationalizing how freshwater is created to foster this massive tree that when it falls will signal the end of times, Ragnarok. And one sign is Yormungandr lets go of its tail, and another is when Nidhogg successfully breaches the tree roots. And in this case, that would mean that the ocean currents stop flowing, which would cripple the Atom tree or this Elbaffian tree. Elbaff having this complex underground system would make it a central location for the world's currents, which actually fits my godfather Shanks theory really well, since I said Shanks rules over these currents, and now I'm saying these currents originate from Elbaff. But the necessity for this underground structure of an icy realm that creates mist that confronts a volcanic zone is realized by the narrative, because we have the Kid pirate sunk off the coast of Elbaff. Many assume Kid to be written out of the series, but the most rational thinking, especially at this point, is that Kid and his pirate crew will most likely not be found dead and simply sucked into this underground structure, finding themselves most likely in hell. Which wouldn't be the first time we've seen something like this happen, when Big Mom and Luffy both didn't make it to Wano safely. Instead, they were taken underwater and spat out onto some coast. And the goal of Kid's crew would essentially be to make it back to Midgard from the underground after a mini training arc, which thanks to chapter 1115 might be a definite reality, since Tomorrow Black has appeared to impersonate Kid, which he did to Luffy when the Straw Hats were in a similar situation as Kid's crew. But anyways, now to further substantiate the existence of this Nilfheim or icy realm within Elbaff, it's not just the physical requirement of the tree, the mythological references, the narrative relevance, but it's also a pre-established mystery Oda brought us again from the eerily similar creation of Punk Hazard, where we got the Sea of Fire, which would be a reference to Muspelheim within the underworld, but also on the cold side, we got the Yeti Cool Brothers, which when Oda elaborated on their origins, we find out that they are a pair of giants of mystery race that are bigger than oars, but also an interestingly young age of 25. So if these giants were from Elbaff, the same Elbaff that Dory and Brogy were from, it'd be likely that they're from the icy realm, which substantiates its existence. But along with the rest of the video, support the notion of what's most likely going to be a subglacial volcano or a glacial volcano. And there's one more reason I bring up the Yeti Cool Brothers, but first I want to acknowledge and consolidate that Elbaff will become a cornerstone in the series by connecting nearly every structural phenomenon that Oda has introduced to us in the series. Everything that has made One Piece feel larger than life will without a doubt find its moments of revelations here in the land of giants, Elbaff, found in the region called Warland, which most likely contains 3 primary levels. Asgard would be missing, Midgard is half underwater where the human part is sunk 200 meters below the sea level, and Jotunheim is showing, and that's where Loki would be ruling. And the level we talked about mostly in this video, which would be the underworld. And to give you all a taste of what's to come, let me do one last extrapolation I made during the making of this video. See, underlying the story of One Piece, especially now, we are looking at the sinking of the world. But since the beginning, even in Alabasta, we were confronted with climate change ramifications like the dominating seawaters that could overtake a nation's river and devastate the lands due to the lack of precipitation. Elbaff will be a place with too much precipitation. But if what I'm beginning to realize is actually a focal point of the story, it's the desalinization of the water. That's going to be really important for a lot of reasons, but here are a few simple ones. Vikings traded in salt and valued it highly, to the point that, as a reference, one of Oda's favorite shows as a kid and a partial inspiration for One Piece is Vicky the Viking, where Vicky's dad Halvar in the first episode comes home with a massive haul with treasures, and one of which was being an entire bag of salt. But even for the story of One Piece, salt has always just been an incredibly interesting piece of the world. It's such a simple thing, but something that's just a staple flavoring for food, and what Sanji considers essential for human survival, is also an important purification material in Thriller Bark, in exorcising shadows from zombified corpses, because it contains the essence of the ocean within it. Brook even had to raid an entire kitchen for it to fight the raid boss Oars, which you'd think that's where it stops, but like our world and the Straw Hats' journey, it was dictated by ocean salinity, which created travel conditions, but also is a huge reason for crop growth inhibition and island survival, because as I theorized earlier, the large bountiful lands with huge life forms on it are all supported by vast freshwater resources, whether it be Wano, Skypiea, Rusukaina, and most likely Elbaff. I am almost certain that the huge freshwater reserve that I theorized will play this role in Oda's world building, and for that reason it might make a lot of sense to put out there that this desalinization thing is something Oda has been really insidious about. For one, he has Luffy staring at Sanji prepare the process during Skypiea arc in chapter 253. Faced with the unknown water of the Sky Island, Sanji set up the natural water for it to be steamed and then dripped off a cooler plate on top where it would be caught in a central pot. In a small way, Oda was embodying how humans got fresh water from salt water, while the Straw Hats were analyzing the Sky Sea's interesting features. This was the chapter where Robin noted the large flora and fauna and said it must be due to the differences in Blue and White Sea. And when you look at this pot setup, it's just something that's part of the world building where Oda uses actual survival skills to solidify the realistic feeling within the fictional One Piece world. But Oda also went as far as addressing this in the SBS. This feels like one of those minor things that Oda will describe without us batting an eyelash, only for it to become a huge part of his world building. And when Oda in subtle ways makes this salinity and temperature gradient something that reoccurs, whether it be on Punk Hazard or the Wano waterfalls. But there was one other place that was super odd that when I started to describe the place beneath Elbaf, I realized what I imagined was already in existence in the One Piece world, and it opened a huge gateway into a theoretical context that may have existed in the Void Century. And to give you a quick clue is that the world underneath Elbaf in my vision would essentially be some form of pillar that reaches from the sea surface to the bottom of the ocean floor. This pillar would have ice and fiery components, but it would essentially embody the Norse version of the underworld and contain various hells. And by now you might have realized that Impel Down, that's placed essentially on the opposite side of the planet from where Elbaf would theoretically be, is a man-made hell with an extremely questionable history. We have yet to know who could have built such a thing, and under what context. Was it the Fishmen? But if Ryukyu Kingdom's ancient forefathers chose Fishman Island's location because it's the only place with sunlight, then why would they have made Impel Down? And I had a video in the past questioning Wano's involvement because Wano's Kozuki clan was known for their stone masonry in the past. In this video, I even tied how Marineford was a crescent moon shape, which could be related to the moon clans of Wano. And because sea stone exists in Impel Down structure, maybe Wano had to be involved. And maybe they still are. But now I think I have convinced myself that the giants probably built Impel Down, and the context that we know Impel Down for is extremely odd. Sure, it's a prison that the world government seems to have repurposed to hold their criminals, exposing them to various levels of hells depending on the severity of their crimes. But I say repurposed because there are several clues that they didn't build it. One being they haven't shown anything comparable in our timeline, two being that the random poneglyph that I pointed out a long time ago that's on level 3, and even if we don't think it's a poneglyph, the third thing is that they have so little knowledge of their own prison that an entire new level could be created, and ironically that level of hell was created by a giant. Yeah, 100 years ago, Mortally the Giant made level 5.5. But this part of the conversation isn't where I want to focus on, because what's interesting is that they have a frozen hell level 5, which would be Nilfheim technically, then level 4 just above is blazing hell resembling Muspelheim, and it's hot because of a specific well that is heated up and bubbles with boiling blood, just like Velgamir would. And above that is level 3 starving hell that is heated by the floor below via a vent for the smoke and is generally a desert sand level. And quickly above that there's beast level and level 1, which is crimson hell, which has a bunch of spiky trees. The spiky trees reminded me of what was described with the roots in hell of the Norse wood tree having venomous spikes, but the real interesting focus is levels 5 to 3, because technically that would be a giant desalinization plant of some sort. How does level 5 even get snow? But technically that would be fresh water. We even see plant life there. Maybe due to it being so low below the surface, the higher pressure and no sunlight would make it easier to be this cold, but then going to the third floor, the air is vented here from level 4's blazing hell. And you'd think that this sand was just imported here and it's hot because of the smoke. But in order to get the sand here, one of the easiest ways would just to be pool a bunch of seawater here and then evaporate the water using the heat from below, thus leaving the sand behind. And that's when we hit another interesting point in Impel Down. It actually has underwater vents that allow the blue gory to go in and out of Impel Down while underwater. And Oda kind of skipped diving too deep into that, but I was kind of thinking how unnecessary this was. Couldn't the blue gory just hunt it from the top? And again, this hatch existing in a prison to give people just another way of potentially escaping is crazy. Obviously this region being in the calm belt and surrounded by sea kings is a huge deterrent, but the characters that these things aren't a deterrent to would find this hatch to be one of the easiest ways to escape Impel Down, and goes back to the idea that Impel Down was repurposed rather than originally made to be a prison. And it might be that originally these hatches were used to pull seawater into level 3 to create fresh water or steam. And when you look at the top of Impel Down, it has a forest surrounded with a moat which separated water in between. It would make sense if this water was fresh water that was pulled together for this forested top. The original design of Impel Down might be some sort of man-made recreation of what lies underneath Elbaff. At the moment, the purpose for doing something like this either escapes me or deserves its own explanation. But if you were to add the new 1115 information of the sea level dropping 200 meters in the past, then it might be that these vents were level with the water and pulled in excess seawater that would then be used to desalinate to either support this forest or some other primary purpose, which I'm just giving some context on how this theory continues to grow with new information. But the reason I brought it up is because I thought it was kind of crazy that I was theorizing about some kind of underground structure that would essentially function as a desalination plant that contains a cold realm and a hot realm to tie into Norse mythology, and realize that it technically already exists in the One Piece world. And to add on, the thing I said about the Yeti Coal brothers is that yes, they were a mystery race, but Oda actually gave their concept arts and they were originally supposed to be giant blue gorillas, which I thought was crazy because Impel Down Nilfheim would have had the blue gory to further substantiate this parallel of icy giant gorillas existing on Elbaff, which would be where the Yeti Coal brothers are from. And now that chapter 1115 came out, it's kind of crazy because the exact kind of pillar structure underwater that I envisioned was mysteriously revealed to us with no context, underwater somewhere. And I'm not saying this would be the place that I'm talking about, but if I were to have drawn something, this easily could have fit the description. And I just want to acknowledge that because it could be that this was what was beneath Elbaff. But I also have several other theories on that, so getting back on topic, I want to summarize everything we discussed in the video as best as I can. But before I get to that, I hope you enjoyed this ride through the logic of my theory. I think this video helped me realize how much of the One Piece world is actually connected to Norse mythology and our world's physical geography. And I appreciated even the coincidences, but in the potential that it's not a coincidence and Oda had this all planned, I think it would make sense if underlying some of our favorite arcs was a hidden Viking reference that Oda would eventually connect back when we get to Elbaff. Now that we know that Nika is a legend from Elbaff, I have a completely new context to add to all of my future videos, and if you're interested, definitely subscribe to hear more, because remember, this was just covering the hell of Elbaff. The next major video will cover the Asgard world and Usopp, and they will connect back to the various unanswered paths of discussion that I left in this video, or further build up other points. And to review some of the main points I want to get across in this video was that fresh water and seawater will without a doubt become a huge analysis point for the series. Keep in mind we still don't know how sea stone is made, yet its ingredient pyrobloin, which we also don't know about, creates something like the Emperor Cloud, but continues to be relevant even in Egghead through Vegapunk. We have to pay attention to the random freshwater reservoirs like Skypiea and Wano because we have proof that this source of fresh water could explain the giant land animals and plants that exist there, and this will 100% be an emphasis point in Elbaff because there are giant people, giant animals, but most importantly, the largest plant life that we have ever seen in the One Piece world. And if Oda continues the trend of how he consistently roots his world in our world's basic functions, then this tree would need not just a giant reservoir of fresh water, but also a replenishing source of fresh water, or in other words, some kind of natural mechanism that sustains this tree using the natural water cycle. And for that, we constructed a prototype using Norse mythology, which is generally based off of Iceland, where we found basically exactly what would create the natural desalination plant that would generate so much fresh water, which in one of the simplest forms would just be the Subglacial volcano that would create a land of mist, in other words Nilfheim, which would house a bubbling, boiling spring of fresh water, which would be Velgamir, one of the wells that feeds one of the main roots of the world tree in Norse mythology. And most importantly, in my opinion, this structure underneath Elbaff would be responsible for some of the largest world mechanisms, which would also align with Norse mythology and our world's mechanics. Yormungandr, the giant sea serpent that wraps around the world, would be created by Elbaff's desalination plant as a result of creating mass amount of salt sediment, which we know helps create deep sea currents in One Piece world and ours, and because of the immense water pressure provided by the tree roots, it would create the Nidhogg and other various currents, which could essentially be the White Strom, both of which are long-standing creating mysterious deep sea currents that have gone unexplained as we entered the new world, and are perfect ways for Kid's crew and even Law's crew to find themselves carried by because they were so close to Elbaff after being defeated by the respective Yonko opponents. They would both find their ways to the hells of Elbaff, where both Law and Kid will become exposed to one of the most important structures for the One Piece world to exist, but also explains why Shanks uses Elbaff as a headquarters and supports my completely separate theory where I proclaim that Shanks is the master or ruler of these massive ocean currents, which would further make sense if Elbaff was central to those currents. And important to include in this would be that if the Norse apocalypse of Ragnarok were to occur, the signs would be the two ocean currents ceasing and ultimately mean that the world tree in Elbaff was collapsing. Adding the context of chapter 1115, we could add that it's likely that a millennia ago, more of Midgard was exposed, and the hell of Elbaff was still beneath the water, but was supporting even more life on the island. This entire theory fits perfectly into that scope, and the one thing I would add is that it could be that the partial collapse of this tree could have made the ocean levels rise. Another way to think about the Atom Tree is that it's a giant water sink that turns water into leaves and provides oxygen for the world. If this tree or another tree were keeping in equilibrium, then destroying this tree or its roots would be cataclysmic. It could be that this is what the giants have control of, and it could be this is why Shanks is positioning himself on Elbaff. If Elbaff were to fall into the wrong hands or its foundations were shaken to its roots by one of the great powers, then the end of the world would most certainly follow. But I'll stop myself there because there are many things here that I could have added but I had to cut for the sake of the video, but I do want to bring up some of them because most of these things will be making it into upcoming videos and they're interesting things for you guys to think about. The first one is Iceland's capital, which from multiple angles was considered the first Icelandic settlement there, and the reason I think this place might be interesting is its name, Reykjavik. Vik is the same from Viking, which means bay, but Riker, which means smoke, so smoky bay. And considering how we talked about Elbaff most likely containing an insane combination of glacial and volcanic activity, I could see Oda making a land out of smoke or consumed by smoke, and this could be where Loki is from. It could be that the Loki we know of in the current timeline isn't the mythical god Loki that we normally reference, but rather the giant Loki, who's also known as Skyrim, who is lord of the Utgard castle. And I'll stop that one there for now, but just know that this might come up in a future video. And so another huge thing that I want to reveal, which goes back to the whole pyrobloin conversation. I had mentioned something along the lines of why it doesn't matter if pyrobloin is salt, and I'm confident that the clouds are to be referred to as fresh water, and part of the reason this is important is because of something Robin found during chapter 253 that I've heard no one really talk about, but I remember vividly during my chapter reactions during the Kuma flashback. When Bonnie developed the mysterious sapphire scales, I could have sworn I had seen sapphire gems before in One Piece, and at the time I asked on stream and in the podcast, but no one could remember what I was talking about, and what I remembered was this piece of rock salt that Robin found on lakeside shore of Upper Yard. Nami calls it a blue gemstone, and in the black and white manga it doesn't really stick out, but I was originally an anime viewer, so this is what I remembered, and it was so long ago that I watched this that I completely forgot. And while it looks weird in the anime, the official digital manga colored it as this really beautiful blue square rock. If this is truly rock salt like Sanji says, then it's most likely halite, which is why this is interesting. For one, minerals of similar compositions formed in Iceland, and some were called sunstones. Though they were a stone of mythos that were said to be able to find the sun's true direction even in an overcast day or when it was beneath the horizon, there was actually merit to this mythos, as similar stones with some of the properties were discovered, though it seemed to be scientifically due to double refractive properties of the prism created by the salt formations. That could be something important for Elbaff, but that's obviously not what I want to direct us towards, because I did want to tease my future Bonnie video a little bit by saying the blue halite that they found on Skypiea could be a really interesting clue for us if Oda were to be super detail oriented, but from what I know, halite or rock crystals can come in various colors due to trace minerals left inside the salt structure, and the more rare blue type comes from a heavier amount of potassium left inside the structure, which this detail could open up a huge new avenue towards thinking about what happened in the One Piece world. For one, potassium's name comes from pa ash, or rather the ashes of plants. In our world, seawater was the original primary source of it, as well as volcanic rock and obviously ashes. So if that's the case, why was it found in such large quantities in the Sky Island? And it makes you wonder, wonder, does this relate to Bonnie's skin condition? I think so, and I do have an answer, but if I said all my ideas, we'd be here forever. There's so many different directions I could take us in, whether it be for Blackbeard, Devil Fruits, the Sunlight Tree Eve, or Nika and Asgard. But where you should direct yourself is to the comment section to leave a thought about any of the ideas I brought up. I'd love to hear it. I'm going to be focusing on maximizing my output of videos, so apologies for pulling back on streams and interacting in general, but I hope you all understand and are considering subscribing for more. And if you enjoyed this video, drop a like and share this video, because for me, the One Piece world continues to get bigger and grander with each passing chapter. And at the root of my happiness is enjoying this world with all of you. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next part vision.